Okay, just want to make sure that you can hear me. I know that you're all muted, but I want to make sure that my computer is great. Excellent. Um, so we have a topic today that could be enormous. And as I was preparing, I found myself cutting back and cutting back and cutting back on more and more slides because it's a big topic. But really, I want to bring out a few things that are unique or unusual about the Western Sephardic tradition, the way we do things here in Shearith, Israel. And the topic we're talking about tonight is the Mourner's Kaddish. You asked me why we're doing the Mourner's Kaddish when we could be doing something about Shabbat Shirah. It's a random walk down Mill Street. I don't know. It's what I chose to talk about today. Also, last year I spoke about Shabbat Shirah. So if you want to watch that video, it's available online. And you can hear the Hai Naum and all those other special things that we'll be doing this Shabbat. But the topic we're doing is the Mourner's Kaddish. And I should say that I want to thank our sponsor, Susan Fine, Dina Fine, who's sponsoring today's session in memory of her parents. And the reason I'm speaking about this is a few weeks ago, I've been wanting to speak about this for a long time, but a few weeks ago, I took a scholar, a real scholar, to our archives. The scholar is also a rabbi, and his specialty is minhagim and nusach tefillah. And when I told him some of the unique things about Shearith Israel's customs relating to the Mourner's Kaddish, he had no idea. He'd never heard of it before. And this is a man who's well read in minhagim. And so I guess I realized at that time that what I took for granted is not well known outside of people who are familiar with the Spanish-Portuguese tradition. So I thought I would talk about it a little bit today. So let's get to what we're talking about. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. We're talking about the Mourner's Kaddish. Just by thumbs up, you can see my screen, my shared screen. Yes? Excellent. Very good. And thank you, Dina, for sponsoring today's session. So the place to start, of course, is what is the Mourner's Kaddish that we say here at Shearith Israel, and how do we say it? And then we'll talk about what's different than other communities, and go through the history of the Mourner's Kaddish in doing so. So let's move this a little bit here. Okay. Okay, so this screen is a little bit busy, but basically I have in the daily service, the mourners will recite Kaddish 3 times, if not more. And the places they recite Kaddish are the first initial Kaddish de Rabbanan, which occurs at the end after the Korbanot, before the Zemirot proper. And that's what you see on the right hand of your screen. It has the whole Kaddish language there and the translation. And the main thing to pick up about Kaddish, if you aren't familiar with this prayer, I think most people are familiar since we say it so frequently. But the core message of this prayer is that we bless the name of the Lord. Yehi Shem Adonai Mevarach me'atav v'ad olam, Yehi Shemei Rabbah Mevarach le'alam la'alamei almaya, that the Lord's name shall be blessed forever and ever. And that's the response that people say to the opening paragraph, which is what's called a doxology. It's a praise of the name of the Lord. Does not have anything to do with death or mourning at all. And there are different forms of Kaddish, which we're going to talk a little bit about very briefly. But the first one that mourners say is this Kaddish de Rabbanan, the rabbi's Kaddish, which is intended to be said after reading in the prayers or studying some piece of rabbinic literature, Mishnah, essentially, or Talmud. And then we have the prayers proper, the Psukei de Zimra, the Shearith. At the end of the Shearith, after the prayers are formally finished with the Kaddish Kabal, we have the Shir Shel Yom, we have the Psalm of the day, which is then followed by a Kaddish, which we call here Yehei Shalama. And that's what you see up on the top here. So we say the Shir Shel Yom, the psalm of the day. Each day of the week has a different psalm. And then that's concluded with this paragraph of verses. And the mourner then says this Kaddish. And I want you to know, Rabbi Dr. Poole, and this is from Dr. Poole Sidor, it says Kaddish Yehei Shalama. It puts in parentheses Le'avel, for the mourner. And Yehei Shalama just means that when you go from this Kaddish, you don't say the Rabbanan, you go straight from the Amiran Be'alama to Yehei Shalama Rabbah. Sometimes they call it Kaddish Shalem, the whole Kaddish. Or in the Ashkenazic jargon, Kaddish Yatom. And then that is immediately followed by a Mishnah, which is, or Ein Kelokenu, then a Mishnah. And then you get some verses at the end of the Mishnah, which is significant actually. And then we say another Kaddish D'Rabbanan, also for the Abel. And that is the basic Kaddishim that a mourner says in the morning service every single day. But there's some additions. So that's that. Then you say Aleinu and it's over. So we've said 3 Kaddishim. The mourner has said 3 Kaddishim during the course of the morning service. Aleinu, and the service is over. But see here, right after Aleinu, this Kasher Ein Omrim Hashkabah Acharei Ha. Where's this thing over here? Acharei HaTefilot Nohagin Lenagen HaPesukim Ha'ela Lefnei HaKaddish Shel Avel. And then you get a kind of strange translation of that in English. If there be present one desiring to say the mourner's Kaddish, it is introduced by the following verses from the book of Proverbs. Which we have a little chant for. And the mourner says Kaddish. It's a little bit strange that says if one is desiring to say another Kaddish, why should one be desiring? It's not obligatory. The other one that says the mourner says this is if one desires to say it. We'll talk about that a little later. And then that's the end of the Shachrit. That same thing at Mincha, we have the Mincha. Then after the Mincha Amidah, we have a psalm, and then the Kaddish for the Abel, Yehei Shalama. And then we say Arbit. The same thing. There is a after the Amidah, there is a Kaddish, and then a Kaddish for the after the Amidah, there's a Kaddish at Kabal, a psalm, Kaddish for the Abel, and then we get another strange addition. Right after the Kaddish for the Abel, it says in the book, Bifnei Abel HaChazan Omer HaPesukim Ha'ela. This is for the evening. After the mourner says his Kaddish, the Chazan in front of a mourner, the Chazan will say these verses. V'ha'avel Omer HaKaddish Pam Shnit. The mourner says Kaddish a second time. In the English, it expands it a little bit. When, as on an anniversary, a mourner says Kaddish a second time, no explanation, the reader introduces it with the following verses. Adonai Tzavot Imanu Miskav Lana Elo Yaakov Selah. These three verses. And this we use sometimes if we need to add a Kaddish. This is what to use. Why we need to add a Kaddish, we're going to talk about a little later. So that's already unusual, that they have Kaddishim that are optional, but have a formula to introduce them if needed. That's a little bit unusual. Okay. Now, I chose Rosh Chodesh because it had the most easily visible rubrics, the instructions in the prayer book to discuss. But the most unusual thing about the Western Sephardic recital of the mourner's Kaddish is that on certain days, Rosh Chodesh, Shabbat, every week Shabbat, holidays, the mourner does not say Kaddish. And you can see that in the instructions here from Rosh Chodesh. So on the right-hand side, you'll see the Arbit service, which has begun with Baruch Nafshi. Right after that, it tells you, you finish the Arbit like regular, except you add Yalev Yabo in the Amidah, and then Lo ha'avel ela hashliach tzibor omer Kaddish Yehei Shalama Rabbah. The mourner does not say Kaddish on Rosh Chodesh, the Chazan does. In the morning, it gives you a little bit different instruction, similar. It says that at the end of the Shearith, Kaddish is said by the Chazan. Then the mourners don't say Kaddish ad acharei aleinu shalbeach, until after Alein. So already this is a little unusual because they're saying that you add a Kaddish for the mourners. It doesn't tell you to do this, but it's implied in the instruction. After Aleinu, which is the formal conclusion of the Rosh Chodesh morning service, you can add a Kaddish and the mourners can say it then, but not during the regular tefillah. Why this is what we're going to discuss. Solomon, you're 100% right. Solomon wrote a note, if anyone is sitting in Shiv'ah, or at the finishing of the Shloshim, or the 11 months, you'll say Sidu Kadin, or that's for someone in the Shiv'ah, or you'll say Hashkabah, be like a Mavet is recited before Kaddish. So that he's referring to what it says there before the Shearith. We're going to get to all of the things that you're talking about. You know already much more than most. So we'll get there. Okay. So in order to figure out what's happening here, we have to discuss a little bit what is Kaddish. And the best way to do that, went a little too far, is to actually just use the summary to summarize what Dr. Poole has written. Many people know that Dr. Poole was the rabbi of Shearith, Israel, but probably fewer people know that he was a scholar on the Kaddish. And that was what his doctoral thesis was, which was published in 1909, right around the time he was hired here. He had finished his doctorate in Germany. He had studied in yeshiva as well as university there, and his thesis was on the Kaddish. And he tells you what is the Kaddish. The Kaddish is in origin a closing doxology, which means a praise of the Lord, to an agadic discourse, as is clear from the following passages, which we're not going to go through. But he summarizes all of the literature, and he brings many different examples of the place of the Kaddish in the Talmudic literature, which was not in the regular prayers. It's not like we have it today where we say it in the prayer book all the time, but at the end of a study session of agadic discourse. What is agadic discourse? People would gather in the synagogues on Shabbat and weekdays and other holidays to listen to the Torah and to hear a drasha. And the rabbi who was giving the drasha would conclude with agadah, with some drasha on the parasha or on the text that he was studying, an expansion of it, not just the literal meaning, but an expansion of it, often having to do with the coming of the Messiah, or some other kind of good news at the end, which was then followed, because everyone was gathered around to hear the Torah, with Kaddish. So you'd have the study of Torah and the blessing of the Lord's name. And that was the formulaic way of giving a drasha. It would conclude with Kaddish. That's the origin of it. And you'll see it says, collectively, these passages leave no doubt that the Kaddish was a closing doxology to an agadic discourse, the final expression in prayer of the messianic hope pictured by the preacher's words. You can read through all these sources on your own. I can send you the sources if you want, but take it from, that's the origin of Kaddish, which means that it's pretty old. It comes from the Second Temple period. Not in the form that we have it today, but as a concluding prayer to the study of Torah in the Beit Midrash and the Beit Knesset. Okay. But how does it get into the Siddur? What is its function in the Siddur? And that, we could look at different sources, but the easiest thing to do is look at the Maimonides, look at Rambam. And we have two sources here, which are similar in what they tell us, but we'll read both of them because they each have a little bit different element. First one is from Hilchot Tefillah, the 9th chapter, Seder Tefillot HaTzibur Kachu. This is the order of the communal prayer. In the morning, Kol ha'am yoshavin u'shliach tzibor yored lifnei hateba. Everyone's sitting down in the synagogue. The chazan goes up to the teba, and he stands in the center. Umatchil, and he begins. What does he begin with? V'omer Kaddish v'chol ha'am onin amen. Yehei shemei rabbah mevarach la'alam la'almei al-maya b'chol kochan. They say it with all their strength. Ve'onin amen besof Kaddish, they say amen. Ve'achar kach omer baruchu et Hashem mevorach, ve'hem onin baruch Hashem mevorach le'olam va'ed. This is where we start the Shachrit, right? We say Psukei de Zimra, that's not listed here. Dishtabach, and then we have Kaddish, what we call a Chatzi Kaddish, and then Baruchu, and then Shachrit. That is where the Chatzi Kaddish is where Maimonides starts the prayers in the morning. Then a little later, he tells us in the Seder HaTefilot, which is comes right afterwards. He has Kaddish v'nefilat apayim, Kaddish and Tachanunim. Shliach Tzibor Omer Kaddish le'olam kodem kol tefillah. Before every prayer service, the Chazan says Kaddish. Va'achar kol hatefillah, and afterwards he says it. And also after study of Torah, Seder Hayom, B'chol 8 sheyomar Seder Hayom yitchanen ma'at. You have a little tachanun. And says Kaddish. Ukishiyashlim lekrot batorah, b'chol 8 sheitchanen b'divrei tachanunim. You also say Kaddish after you read Torah, and every time you have the tachanunim, when you finish all the tachanunim, you'll mark Kaddish. These are the places that you say Kaddish. Before the tefillah, after the Amidah, after the reading of Torah, after the tachanun. These are the places that you have Kaddish. So they signify the beginning and ending of various parts of the service, frequently between or at the end of the beginning and the end of the prayer or the study of Torah. Let's see what some chats are here. Okay. That is the function of the Kaddish in prayer. The Rambam also calls what we call Kaddish Tit Kabal, the very concluding Kaddish, calls it Kaddish Batra, the end Kaddish. And then everybody goes home. And that's it. He didn't have what we have, all these extra verses and Aleinu Shabeach. After the Kaddish Tit Kabal, everyone goes home. Which is why some people have the custom of taking off their tefillin there. I don't know I haven't seen it really written anywhere. I'm sure it's somewhere, but I have seen people do that after the Kaddish Kabbalah. Even though we still have more prayers, they take off their tefillin because that's really where the tefillah ends. Okay. So how do we get the Mourner's Kaddish? What is the origin of the Mourner's Kaddish? So there is a long backstory to the origin of the Mourner's Kaddish, which I don't want to get too far into. But I'll tell you the narrow story is that Kaddish for the mourner begins in medieval Ashkenaz in the 12th century. Before that, it was unknown. And all of the early sources, which mainly come from Machzor Vitri and the Rokeach and these, Or Zarua and early Ashkenazic sources, quote this very famous story about Rabbi Akiva, so famous that people don't really know where it comes from. So a story told in many different recensions. It's midrashic in nature, but nobody really knows where it first started or how it came to be. There's a lot of scholarship on it, and I'm not even going to touch that issue. If you want to look up this story about Rabbi Akiva, there's tons of scholarship on it. But for our purposes, it's not necessary. What we do want to know is that there is a story that is associated or quoted in connection with the Mourner's Kaddish. You've probably heard this story before, but I'm going to read it to you in English as it appears in the Machzor Vitri, translated into English. Okay. The story is told of Rabbi Akiva, who was walking in a cemetery and came across a naked man who was dark as coal and carrying a load of sticks on his head. Some of the versions say a crown of thorns. Thinking that he was alive, Rabbi Akiva asked him how he had gotten into this situation of needing to do difficult work and offering to redeem him from his servitude. The man said to Rabbi Akiva, "Get out of my way." And then Rabbi Akiva said, what are you talking about? What's going on here? The man said to Rabbi Akiva, "I'm actually dead, and every day they send me to cut down trees." So what did you do when you were alive, said Rabbi Akiva? I was a tax collector, the man replied, and I would favor the wealthy and the poor would get killed. Rabbi Akiva asked him, haven't you heard anything from those who are punishing you about how you might be relieved from this punishment? I did hear one impossible thing, he said. They told me that the only way to get out of this situation is if I had a son who stood up in Minyan and declared, Baruch Hu et Hashem mevorach. And they answer after him, Yehei Shemei Rabbah mevorach. If that were to happen, I would be released from this punishment. I don't have a son. I left behind a pregnant wife. I don't know if she gave birth or not. And I don't know if the son, if she did give birth, who could possibly have taught that my son Torah? Since nobody liked me, I was a tax collector. Everybody hated me. Immediately, Rabbi Akiva decided he would go and search see if this man did have a son. So Rabbi Akiva asked, "What is your name?" He said, "My name is Akiva." Rabbi Akiva was talking to a deceased person named Akiva. What is your wife's name? Shushbina. There's scholars who talk all about these names and what they could possibly mean. He asked, where are you from? He said, Ludkia. Also, it's not all the same in all the versions. Some of the scholars talk about what that means also. Immediately, Rabbi Akiva put himself to great difficulty to find the man's family. By the way, well, I'll get there another time. We don't have enough time for me to go through all those different things. But Rabbi Akiva went to find the man's family. When he made it to the town, he asked about this man. Oh, may that man's bones erode, they responded. He asked about the wife. May her memory be wiped out, they said. He asked about the child. He isn't even circumcised. Rabbi Akiva immediately circumcised the boy, put a book in front of him. He couldn't learn anything until Rabbi Akiva fasted for 40 days. A bat kol emerged and said, you're fasting for this child? Rabbi Akiva said, Master of the universe, have I not prepared him before you? Immediately, God opened up the boy's heart, and he was able to learn Torah, said the Shema, and Birkat HaMazon. Rabbi Akiva brought him to the synagogue. He said Baruch Hu, and recited. They said Baruch Hashem Barach immediately. After that, the boy's father was released from the punishments in hell. Immediately, the boy's father came to Rabbi Akiva in a dream. Said, May it be God's will that you rest for all time in Gan Eden, for you saved me from the punishment of Gehenna. Rabbi Akiva responded with Psalm, God's name is forever, God's memory passes from generation to generation. And now here is the key words. This is in the Machzor Vitri, which is a 12th century Sidur, or commentary on the Sidur. Therefore, the custom developed for someone who doesn't have a father or mother to say Baruch Hu or Kaddish on Motza'ei Shabbat. I'll read this is part in the Hebrew because it's important. Al kain nahagu la'avor lifnei teva b'motza'ei Shabbat Adam she'en lo avo em lomar Baruch Hu o Kaddish. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the source for the mourner's Kaddish. And if you notice, it's only one person once a week on Saturday night. One person once a week on Saturday night. That is the origin of mourner's Kaddish. In Germany, on Saturday night, one person says Kaddish. One person who is an orphan, which is why, by the way, if you ever thought about it, in the Ashkenazic terminology, which is the origin of the mourner's Kaddish, it's Kaddish Yatom. It's not mourner's Kaddish, it's orphan's Kaddish, not mourner's Kaddish, orphan's Kaddish. This is the origin of it. This is a crazy story. But what are the elements of the story that we can pull out? They are relieving the deceased from their punishments in Gehenna. That is the purpose. And who can do that? The son. A son can relieve the punishments of his father in Gehenna. And that is the origin of this special Kaddish. How does it work? He says Baruch Hu. Doesn't say he says Kaddish even. He says Baruch Hu. But for some reason, that became attached to the Kaddish. Okay, let's see how this plays out. So from here, it goes through all of Ashkenaz, France, Germany, further out east later on, and also south though. So so that from the 12th century, by the 13th century, it's in Italy, and by the 14th century, it's in Spain. And let's see what the next source I have for you. Yeah, here is Rabbeinu Bachya, who has a commentary on the Torah, midrashic, kabbalistic kind of commentary. Bachya ben Ash. There's more than one Rabbeinu Bachya, but this one is who lived in Spain, and the end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century. And so he has he talks about a verse where it says Kaper L'Amecha. It's talking about bringing atonement for the people. And he says, Darshu b'psikta, elu hachayim shemitkaperim b'monam, asher padita elu hametim. So it's talking about, it's drasha on the verses that the those who are living can be atoned for, can with the donations of those who are still living. I'm sorry, the deceased can be given an atonement by the donations of those who are living. And it's talking about hekdesh. So if you bring the first fruits to the temple, the son can atone for the father. I'm not even going to get into it; it's too complicated, and there's too much theology and in there. But the point that I want to make is the next line. V'hu hadin lomar b'shvilo kaddish o shum beracha bebeit knesset b'tzibur. K'mo she'amru ba'agada ba'oto masa shel Rabbi Akiva k'di'ita mesechet kala. And this is the same law which he is darshaning from the Psikta and the Torah about atonement with the first fruits, or bring money to the temple. Same thing as saying Kaddish on behalf of the deceased father, as we know from the story of Rabbi Akiva. So this thing from Germany in the 12th century has now made it to Spain in the end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century. So until that time, there was no Kaddish for mourners. There was Kaddish at the cemetery. There was Kaddish for the Abel after the burial, but there was no mourners Kaddish. That was a development in the Middle Ages. Another Sephardic source for Kaddish is the Rivash Yitzhak Bar Sheshet, who also lived in Spain in the 14th century. And you'll see it's two teshuvot or combined, two parts of the same teshuvah. On the right hand side, you'll see the beginning of it. It says Nahagu b'Sfarad lomar Kaddish Rabbanan, not the Yatom, Kaddish Rabbanan, Mi shemet aviv, kol shnat evlo, al hahu maaseh shera'u aviv shehaya nadon shaya. So that okay. So this is the custom in Spain is to say Kaddish for the father. The son will say Kaddish for the father, based on a story of Rabbi Akiva. And then he gives this tshuva that he doesn't know where this story comes from. Ha-Haggadah eino b'Gemara. This story of Rabbi Akiva is nowhere to be found. Maybe it's in Tanchuma, maybe it's some midrash somewhere. But then he tells you where he learned the source from, and he tells you and quotes it: "B'Sefer Orchot Chaim, shechiber HaChacham Rabbi Aaron HaKohen." The Chacham Rabbi Aaron HaKohen is a Provençal rabbi from France who was exiled when France exiled its Jews. I think 1305, 1309. I forget the exact year. He went to Mallorca. And he had a sefer, a pretty famous sefer, Orchot Chaim, which is being quoted now by a Sephardic rabbi. So a Provençal rabbi is being quoted by a Sephardic rabbi. And there he has this whole story about saying Kaddish for one's parents. And he gives and this is really a quote from the Orchot Chaim, Tiknu Chazal, Lomar Kaddish al ma shenimtza b'Haggadah pam achat paga ribi ploni. That's Rabbi Akiva's story. He found somebody who was being punished in Gehenna, ועל זה פשט המנהג לומר בנו של מת קדיש בתרה, says the final Kaddish, כל י"ב חודש, וגם להפטיר בנביא, ויש מתפללים בכל מוצאי שבת תפילת ערבית, לפי שבאותו שעה חוזרים הפושעים לגיהינם, ששבתו בשבת. So he says that the final Kaddish is said by a son or a child for their parents in order to relieve them of the punishments of Gehinnom, and also that they pray the Arbit at the end of Shabbat, which I assume means that they should be the Chazan. It doesn't really say that exactly. Because at the end of Shabbat, the souls of the deceased return to their punishments in Gehinnom, which they had been resting from on Shabbat. So this is the source for Mourner's Kaddish. And what I didn't show you, because it's just there's too many sources, it gets too involved, but there is a long history of what happens in the afterlife. And the sources are all over the place because nobody really knows. But the sources are all over the place. Most of the earlier sources indicate that a person who has been punished to go to hell, to Gehinnom, receives that punishment forever, and there's nothing they can do. Some sources indicate that no, there are things that can elevate the person out of Gehinnom into Gan Eden, and there's all sorts of sources all over the place. One of the things that you see in some of these sources is that the souls of those being punished in hell, in Gehinnom, rest on the Shabbat. In fact, there's a famous story of Tyrannus Rufus, who was not a Jew, from the Mishnaic era, from the Roman times, that he was punished in Gehinnom, but the punishments were stopped on Shabbat, and only returned after Shabbat. Now, this is a whole inyan we'll talk about another time regarding the three verses we say at the end of Mincha, Tzidkatecha Tzedek Leolam. But it's related, because what it means is that at the end of Shabbat, at least according to the ancient view, the souls are returning to their punishments after having rested on Shabbat. And that is the reason that in origin, they said Kaddish at that time. If you remember, it started with one person, one time on Saturday night, that extended later on all over the place. Now, with that background, I'm just going to summarize a little bit. I think I've said it enough times, but there is a wonderful article which you can read. It's called "You Have Saved Me from the Judgment of Gehenna, the Origin of the Mourner Kaddish in Medieval Ashkenaz." This came out about 10 or 15 years ago. And I'll just read to you what he says, which I think I've already explained to you, but it's a good summary. Sometime in the late 12th or early 13th century, the Jewish communities of Northern Europe began to recite a weekly prayer for the dead. That fact would have been lost to an outside observer who almost certainly would not have noticed. The prayer in question, the Kaddish, contained no references to the dead, had already been a key component of Jewish liturgy for many centuries. The change that took place in the 12th century was very subtle. One prayer service on Saturday night at the conclusion of Shabbat, an orphan would be chosen as the one to say the Kaddish. An apparently minor innovation. But within a few decades, this liturgical development exploded. From its initial attestation in several German liturgical guides, like the Machzor Vitri, which we saw, the recitation of the Mourner's Kaddish spread throughout the Rhineland, to northern France, to southern France, to Bavaria, to Austria, eventually to Spain and Italy. As it spread, it expanded. Before long, the Mourner's Kaddish was being recited daily, and then thrice daily. And the rabbinic decisors fielded increasingly complex halachic questions as to the particularities of its place in the liturgy. Soon, orphans were competing with one another for the chance to recite Kaddish, and communal leaders had to devise elaborate systems in order to determine who would take precedence in doing so. Before long, it was impossible to remember a time when the Mourner's Kaddish was not a component of the liturgy. And so that is the the story of Mourner's Kaddish. Now, how does that get to where we're doing here at Shearith Israel? So, as it spread, well, one thing we can answer already, I think, if you've noticed, and that was that it started off as one person. One person would say Kaddish, and then it expanded to multiple times because you had more than one person who wanted to do this. More than one person wanted to atone for their parent, and so their parents could receive a reprieve from their punishments in Gehinnom. And lots of people wanted to do so. And so they devised systems. Who would say it at which prayer? They would add Kaddishim, so there'd be enough times in the Seit that all the mourners could say it. And if you are familiar with the German customs, the communities that keep the German customs today, Breuers in Washington Heights, or the way they say it in Amsterdam or in Switzerland or in Paris or in certain communities in Israel, is that only one person says Kaddish at a time. And that person is told in advance, and they go and they stand at the front of the synagogue, usually next to the Chazan, depending on the setup of the synagogue. But in traditional Ashkenazic setup, the Chazan prays not in the center, but in the front. And the person saying Kaddish goes and stands next to them and recites the Kaddish. One person, everyone answers that one person. And this is important because in the original theology, the original reason for saying Kaddish, it was the act of saying Baruch Hu that people would answer that was the mechanism for relieving the punishments of the deceased in Gehinnom. The fact that the congregation would answer this child's prayer was what did the job. Because it was the good deed of blessing the name of the Lord, which is what caused it. And therefore, it's important that one person was saying it. Eventually, it became so many people that wanted to say Kaddish that they had to permit multiple people to say it together. This is a longer conversation, and it starts in Sfarad and makes its way back into Ashkenaz. But eventually what happens is and it's late. It's like in the 19th century already, they're debating this kind of innovation to permit, in Germany anyway, to permit multiple people to say Kaddish at the same time. Things that we take for granted today in almost every synagogue in America, almost, was completely foreign to them only a few hundred years ago. And that is multiple people saying Kaddish at the same time, because in their view, that didn't do it. Who was getting the credit for having the Rabbim answer the Kaddish or answer the Baruch Hu? All of them? How is that possible? And so in the traditional Ashkenazic synagogues, only one person. And that, if you are paying attention, is also what they did, at least in the Portuguese community of Amsterdam. And that is still done in the Portuguese community of Amsterdam. And which at some point in the past was done here at Shearith Israel. Now, I have done a little digging, and I cannot find the point and period of time when it changed. But I know for a fact that it did. And that is why, if we go back in our slides, this fact answers some questions. First of all, if you notice, Dr. Poole is pretty careful to write Mourner in the singular. Kaddish Shehei Shlama Le'Abel. If you look at other Sidurim, and I have, the Art Scroll and Chabad, they say Avelim, or Yitomim sometimes, or Avelim usually say, mourners. But really, only one person said Kaddish at a time, at least originally. And that's why that's why it uses that language. And that is why we have this whole rigmarole about adding Kaddishim. If someone desires to say a Kaddish, you can add these verses and say, why would someone desire to say Kaddish? Because they didn't have an opportunity to, because there were other mourners there who took the first three. So you have to add another Kaddish for a fourth mourner. This is how you do it. You add these verses. Same thing over here. Why would there be a second Kaddish? This is a little more complicated and you can see it from the way he writes it. But essentially, it's the same idea. Only one person said Kaddish at a time. So what if you had you wanted to say Kaddish and the first one was already taken? They would add, say verses, and then another person could say Kaddish. So that answers that question. And also the language you'll see when it says Avel in the singular. Let's see what this. Okay, so Rabbi Yaakov Emden was the first to propose it, but he says that the Sephardic custom, and I don't know where he gets it from because he knew Amsterdam pretty well. He says the Sephardic custom was to say it simultaneously. He was the first to propose it in Germany, and it is suggested that this is from Hamburg, from Rabbi Yaakov Emden, that he introduced the saying of the Kaddish Derabanan jointly. Now, later people like Rabbi Yaakov Edinger rail against him, and I think the Chatam Sofer also for this such an innovation. Anyway, when we talk about Ashkenazi customs, maybe we'll talk about that more. But how that happened in Germany. But that's the story with the single person versus multiple people. But we have something else. What is going on with the Rosh Chodesh and Shabbat? Nobody does that, has that limitation except for our community. And as you can probably see where we're going with this, in Italy, in the 16th century, you had a halakha controversy, maybe not halakha, liturgical controversy. Now, in Venice was a city which had Ashkenazic Jews and Sephardic Jews coming in close contact, and that Sephardic community in Venice was Western Sephardic, was the mother community for the Portuguese Jews, the same Jews who would go to Amsterdam, first went to Venice. And this is the 16th century, so it's really, it's before Amsterdam, the growth of Amsterdam. It's when Venice was at its height as the mother community of the Portuguese Jews. And you get an Ashkenazic rabbi named, or an Italian rabbi, Binyamin Ze'ev Bar Matitya of Arta, who was a little bit of a controversial figure because he gets into a big controversy about the giving of presumption. He gets into a big halacha controversy. Somebody claimed from Salonika and said so-and-so is dead, and he freed the wife who was otherwise an aguna. And then there were reports that that person wasn't dead, and there was a huge fight over whether what he did and when he declared that the woman was free to marry was correct or not. That's how he's known for most things. But for our purposes, he spoke about Kaddish in a few places. He was not very nice and not very kind to the Bnei Anusim, to the Portuguese community. And he did not like the idea that there would be Portuguese Jews saying Kaddish for their parent who had never returned to Judaism. He was very unkind toward them and said that it was Asur. But more to the point of what we're talking about now, he notes on his own, it's a collection of responsa, but without anyone having asked the question, he notices. It's a little hard to read this text here because it's an old printing that was never reprinted in modern writing, but he notices that in some of the synagogues in Venice, they prevented people from saying Kaddish on Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh and holidays. They prevented them. By the way, that's what we do here. They stop people from saying Kaddish on Rosh Chodesh and Shabbat and holidays. And he didn't like this, so he says, Ra'iti limso raya hefech divrayim. He decided to go and search out for proof against them. And he has a long tshuva here, deducing proofs that you can say Kaddish on Shabbat and holidays. And one of his first things it says in Ashkenaz, they do that pretty early. If you look at the Maharil, and not in the first generations, but when you get to the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, they're saying Kaddish on Shabbat. This is why, who are you to say that you can't say Kaddish on Shabbat? And then he says that he says kind of anonymously, he heard that there is a rabbi who said that the reason for Kaddish is not to relieve the soul of the deceased from the punishments of Gehinom, rather to elevate the soul in levels of heaven. L'iloi nishamat, l'iloi nishama. And without quoting who it was from, maybe because he didn't know who it was from, or maybe because he just decided it wasn't important at that time, or maybe because he didn't want to implicate the Kabbalistic origin of it, who he's quoting is Rabbi Chaim Vital, who was the student who recorded the customs of the Ashkenazic Rabbi Yitzchak, the Ari, Yitzchak Luria in Tzfat, in the 16th century, who is, based on Kabbalistic reasons, says, you can find it. I found it online, the original text of Chaim Vital, but it's even worse printing than this thing. So I decided just to give you a summary of it, which I found from OU Torah. And you can look it up in the Shah HaKavanot if you wish, but it's a little hard to find a clear printing of it. At least I had trouble. Maybe someone can get me a better printing. Anyway, here is a summary of what Rabbi Chaim Vital wrote. The Ari explained that Kaddish is not only able to save the deceased from judgments in Gehinnom. It's not about reducing the punishments of someone in hell. It can also bring them to Gan Eden and help them be elevated from Madriga to Madriga, from step to step. Because in the Kabbalistic conception, there are 7 levels of heaven. And therefore, even on Shabbat and Yom Tov, when there is no judgment in Gehinnom, it still is important to say Kaddish to get that person to have an aliyah, to get them to the next level. Not to, they're not getting punished on Shabbat, but you can still help them rise from level to level. And that's why he would say Kaddish on Shabbat. Now, when Chaim Vital and the Ari is saying this, he's acknowledging that there are people who say you shouldn't say Kaddish on Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh and Yom Tov. Who are those people? The Western Sephardim. The Western Sephardim. Exactly our community. And so now, let's see if I have any. That's the end of my slide, so I can end it here. So now we can explain why we don't have Kaddish on Rosh Chodesh. We don't have Kaddish on Rosh Chodesh. We don't have Kaddish on Shabbat. We don't have Kaddish on holidays. Because the Spanish and Portuguese conception of what Kaddish is a little bit frozen in time from the earliest sources of the Mourner's Kaddish, having made its way from Germany to Provence, to Spain, to the Portuguese community, and after the expulsion. They're still holding on to this view that Kaddish has its purpose of relieving the soul of the deceased from its punishments in hell. And the deceased don't receive punishments on Shabbat. And there's no purpose in praying for something that has no value. So don't say Kaddish. Mourner shouldn't say Kaddish on Shabbat. There's no purpose in doing it. And that's why we don't have it here. And that is unusual. No other community has retained that kind of antiquated view of the Kaddish. And for that reason, I find it valuable. Others may not. Others may not like that. It's kind of weird. I prefer the idea that we say Kaddish not for these Kabbalistic reasons, not to elevate the soul, but there's a whole nother view, but it's much more modern. And that other view is that we say Kaddish like Tziduk Hadin, to acknowledge that even when we're mourning, even when we're sad and terrible things have happened to us, that God is great. And we say how great God is, even though we might not feel it otherwise because we're in mourning. No, we acknowledge, even when we're mourning, we have to say God is great. That is what I've heard. That's what you'll see in the more apologetic sources, but that's not the origin of Kaddish. That's a later view. And we're still holding on to that old view that Kaddish is for the elevation of the soul to prevent or to alleviate the punishments on Shabbat, punishments in hell. And that doesn't occur on Shabbat. So no Kaddish on Shabbat. Next time you come here and you want to say Kaddish, there's only one. It's really early in the morning, Kaddish Rabbanan. Maybe we'll talk about why that one is a holdout some other day. That's my presentation for you. Please feel free to put comments, questions. I'm going to stop the recording, let everyone talk. Let's see here. Okay.